On a warm June day in 1976, a trio of fishermen on the Oswego River made a grisly catch. Instead of fish, they found a human body drifting toward the surface, bound to heavy cinder blocks beneath the murky water. It was a chilling scene. A young man, clearly the victim of foul play, deliberately weighted down as if someone intended for him never to be discovered. The clues that would be discovered would hint that this John Doe may have been mixed up in the chilling world of organized crime. The body was discovered in mid-June 1976 in the town of Lysander, New York, just north of an area called Three Rivers. Local authorities determined the remains were a white male, approximately 25 to 35 years old, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, and 130 pounds. He had been in the water for an estimated 2 weeks, enough time that decomposition had set in and made immediate identification impossible. A length of rope was used to tie the body to 2 cinder blocks, anchoring it to the riverbed. Those blocks were traced to a nearby company, suggesting the perpetrator sourced them locally. The victim's head was wrapped in part of a light-colored shirt, a grim sign of what likely befell him in his last moments. In other words, someone had suffocated him, likely using that very cloth, then tried to hide the crime by sinking his body in the river. Once the body was recovered, investigators noted distinctive physical features of the victim. He was a slender man with medium-length brown hair and a prominent, angular nose. He had a thin mustache or stubble of dark brown facial hair, as if he hadn't shaved for a few days. There were no tattoos, scars, or obvious identifying marks on the body. Despite the lack of identification, the victim's clothing and personal items provided intriguing clues. He was dressed in layered clothes, a beige cashmere V-neck sweater over a dark blue ribbed turtleneck. He wore blue jeans with a wide brown belt and brown leather designer boots. He also wore a particularly fine pair of underwear, which was only available in a few department stores in New York State. Other personal effects compounded the mystery. He wore a gold neck chain with 2 interesting charms. One was an Italian mano cornuto, a horned hand symbol designed to ward off the evil eye, and the other was a tiny horn-shaped cornicello, again worn for luck. The Italian charms hinted that the victim had a familial connection to Italy. In an effort to identify the victim, investigators collected as much forensic information as possible. Fingerprints were unfortunately not available due to the condition of the remains, but dental records were obtained. They showed the man had extensive dental work, including many fillings and crowns, indicating he had seen a dentist regularly in his life. At a much later date, his DNA profile was also secured and entered into databases, though no match has ever been found to a missing person or family member as of yet. With the trail turning cold, law enforcement sought the public's help. A disturbing forensic facial reconstruction was commissioned to put a face to the victim's remains, using the skull to approximate his features. The clay reconstruction depicted a Caucasian male with a long, thin nose and medium-length brown hair, consistent with the medical examiner's findings. Hoping someone might recognize this face, investigators circulated images of the reconstruction in newspapers and law enforcement bulletins. Unsurprisingly, this depiction, which bears more in common with one of those disturbing Austrian or Bavarian alpine demon masks, didn't solve this case. With this case being unsolved for half a century, despite such distinctive identifying features, a number of theories have proliferated about this case. One prevalent idea centers on the method of disposal. Tying a body to cinder blocks and dumping it in a river is a method reminiscent of an organized crime hit. And this isn't just online sleuths claiming this either, but rather, this has been the main focus of the investigation. The presence of Italian good luck charms on the victim further fuels this line of thought. It's an enticing theory that paints the John Doe as possibly a mob associate or victim of a gang hit. However, no direct evidence has ever emerged linking him to known organized crime, and law enforcement has not confirmed any mafia connection. The mafia theory remains speculative, born from the circumstances more than from concrete proof. Another theory suggests that this man was involved in the mafia in perhaps a much less direct way. Under this theory, he may have invited the vampire into his home, so to speak, by taking out a loan from someone associated with a criminal organization. He may have been unable to pay the exorbitant interest rate, or he may have simply refused to pay, directly leading to him being found in a river. Another theory is that the John Doe wasn't local at all, but a traveler or transient who met a deadly fate far from home. Under this theory, he may have been an Italian tourist who had embarked on a tour across America. During the 1970s, it was common for young people to hitchhike, and in a grim twist, this openness led to many people being targeted by serial predators. However, the authorities appear to consider this to be a much less likely scenario, though this may just be based on simple statistics and demographics. There were way more Italian Americans and Italian immigrants in New York State than Italian hitchhikers in the 70s. Another plausible angle is that the Onondaga County John Doe originated in Canada. In the 1970s, southern Ontario, especially Hamilton, and the Montreal region across the border in Quebec, had significant mafia activity. He could have been in America on a job for one of these mafia families. If the victim was Canadian, that could help explain why he never appeared in American missing persons files. Ultimately, the case will be cracked whenever the local cold case team decides to send his genetic information away for genealogical testing. Until that time, the Onondaga County John Doe will remain a complete unknown, and the person or group who did this to him will keep getting away with it. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit the like button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that share button and send this video to 2 people you know. I'm constantly working on putting out new content, and the best way you can ensure that continues is by clicking that share button and helping the audience grow. On a cold evening in December 2017, a high school auditorium in Bailey, Colorado, buzzed with anticipation for a concert. 17-year-old Maggie Long was supposed to be there, helping manage the event and even bringing homemade cookies for the audience. But as the opening act began, Maggie was nowhere to be found. Instead, just a few miles away, firefighters were battling a blaze at her family's home, a fire that would reveal a horrific crime and leave a community in shock. This is the story of Maggie Long's slaying, an unsolved case that has perplexed investigators and fueled numerous theories in the years since that fateful night. December 1st, 2017 began like any other day for Maggie Long, a senior at Platte Canyon High School. That afternoon, she left school briefly to head home, intending to change clothes and pick up some cookies for the concert she was helping organize at the school. Maggie was known as a responsible and involved student, so when she failed to return to the concert, those who knew her immediately sensed something was wrong. Her older sister, Connie, later said she had a gut feeling something was wrong, since Maggie would never just skip out on an event she was managing. As time passed with no sign of Maggie, Connie tried calling her phone but got no answer. Growing increasingly anxious, she drove toward their family's rural property. When Connie arrived around 7:20 p.m., she was met with a scene of chaos. The Long house was engulfed in flames, and emergency vehicles swarmed the driveway. Firefighters kept the family back as they fought the blaze, and it wasn't until hours later that authorities confirmed their worst fear. Around 7 p.m. on December 1st, a 911 caller reported a fire and disturbance at the Long residence outside Bailey. Firefighters arrived to find the house engulfed in flames. After the blaze was extinguished, responders discovered Maggie's remains in the charred house, and it was immediately clear her death was no accident. Investigators determined that Maggie had been brutally attacked and that the fire was deliberately set to cover up the crime. In fact, investigators discovered multiple ignition points in the house, showing the perpetrator's determination to erase evidence. Evidence at the scene showed she had struggled with her assailants before being overpowered, and horrifyingly, she was set on fire while still alive, according to the coroner's findings. The perpetrators also stole a number of items from the home, including numerous weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They also made off with a small safe that they apparently were unable to crack on site. This suggested the intruders targeted the Longhouse expecting to find valuables and weapons, and they were willing to use extreme violence to get away with their loot. Despite a multi-agency task force, months passed with no arrests or major breakthroughs. Early on, authorities released composite sketches of 3 male suspects seen around the Long property that day. But so far, none have been identified. Investigators tracked down numerous tips and persons of interest, including some local individuals with troubled or violent histories, but every lead eventually went nowhere. Then, an unexpected lead emerged from 700 miles away in Missouri. In mid-2018, a similar case in Missouri, where a young woman was attacked and set on fire during a burglary, caught investigators' attention as a possible connection. The 2 men arrested in Missouri were in their 20s, which led Colorado detectives to investigate whether they had ever been in Colorado around the time of Maggie's death. Ultimately, however, no solid link between the Missouri criminals and Maggie's slaying could be established. From the outset, investigators believed Maggie's slaying was a burglary gone wrong. In their estimation, this was essentially a botched robbery that turned deadly. The items stolen and the apparent focus on the family's safe suggested the intruders specifically targeted the Long home for its valuables. They believed that Maggie's unexpected arrival likely provoked the violent confrontation. However, in 2021, the FBI announced a very different possible motive. Maggie may have been targeted for a very different reason. Her case was reclassified, and agents began investigating whether bias against Maggie's Asian American background played a significant role in this crime. This shift brought additional federal resources to the case and raised the question of whether the extreme cruelty of the attack was driven by this factor. Now, I can't really comment on this much further since the authorities haven't released any evidence whatsoever as to why they have come to this potential conclusion. However, in general, when the FBI comes out and makes a statement like this, they have a very strong reason to believe that's the case. As of now, Maggie Long's slaying is still unsolved, standing as one of Colorado's most haunting cold cases. Nevertheless, neither her family nor law enforcement have given up. The reward for information leading to an arrest now stands at $75,000, contributed by the Long family and multiple agencies involved in the investigation. Further, given the potential motivation for this attack, the authorities are investigating similar crimes both in Colorado and across the nation. Anyway, whether the motive was robbery or something much more sinister, this case is incredibly disturbing, and the perpetrators need to be brought to justice as soon as possible. Unfortunately, Maggie's case hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, so if you're in a position to signal boost her case, get out there and do it. With cold cases like these, the only way they seem to get solved is by ongoing and unrelenting attention to the case. On July 14, 1882, A man named James Yost was hauling wood through the dry grasslands of West Turkey Creek Canyon in Arizona Territory when his dog started acting strangely. Nearing a peculiar cluster of 5 large oak trees that grew in a semicircle from a single root, Yost saw what he first took to be a man sleeping. But the dog's nervous snorting told a different story, and upon investigation, Yost found the lifeless body of one of the West's most notorious outlaws, Johnny Ringo. He was seated on a large, flat rock within the embrace of the oaks, his back against a tree in an almost peaceful pose. But the scene was anything but peaceful. A single bullet had entered his right temple and exited the top of his head. His weapon was still in his hand, and it looked very clear what happened. But as time went on, this clear-cut scene became one of the Old West's greatest mysteries. Ringo was barefoot, his feet wrapped in makeshift bindings torn from his own undershirt. His horse, with his boots still tied to the saddle, wouldn't be found for another 11 days, 2 miles away. He wore 2 cartridge belts, but the one for his revolver was buckled upside down, an inexplicable mistake for a seasoned veteran of the Old West. Most disturbing of all was a small, clean cut at the base of his scalp, as if someone had taken a piece of his head to prove that the deed was done. To understand how Johnny Ringo ended up under those oaks, you have to understand the man he was. Born in Indiana in 1850, his life was defined by a profound, early trauma. At the age of 14, while his family migrated west, he witnessed his father accidentally take a shotgun blast directly to the face. The family was forced to bury him on a hillside along the trail and move on, with little time to contemplate whether this was really an accident or not. This gruesome event created a dark psychological echo that would reverberate throughout Ringo's own life. In the years that followed, Ringo cultivated the persona of a refined, educated gentleman outlaw, a man who could quote Shakespeare and carried a small library of classic books. Many who knew him described him as a reserved, college-educated man, though the truth was more complex. While well-read, Ringo had very little in the way of formal schooling. This intellectual image was a performance, a charming mask for a disturbed and violent man who wanted to be known for something other than his willingness to blast his Roscoe. His outlaw career began in earnest in Texas, where he got his start committing some cold-blooded slayings. After the heat got too hot under the Texas sun, he decided it was best to move on. After drifting to Arizona, he fell in with the loose confederation of rustlers known as the Cochise County Cowboys. In Tombstone, his reputation for a foul temper was cemented by incidents like shooting a man simply for refusing a shot of whiskey in favor of beer. Ringo was not present for the famous showdown at the OK Corral, but in its aftermath, he became a chief antagonist of the Earp faction. He openly challenged Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday to a fight on the streets of Tombstone, a confrontation that was only stopped when a constable intervened. The Earps, in turn, suspected Ringo was involved in the ambush that crippled Virgil Earp and the slaying of Morgan Earp. When Wyatt Earp began his infamous vendetta ride, Ringo, despite being an absolute psychopath, was deputized by the sheriff of Tombstone to hunt him down. Faced with the scene in Turkey Creek Canyon, a coroner's jury quickly reached a verdict. They looked at the scene and figured that this was the work of one man, Johnny Ringo himself. This ruling was supported by a considerable amount of anecdotal evidence. The story about the so-called accident his dad had during the family's westward travels was well known, and suggested a potential family history of this sort of event. In the months before his death, Ringo was reportedly in a deep state of despair. The Earp vendetta had decimated the ranks of his friends and allies. Further, he had recently visited his family in California and had been met with a cool reception and politely told He wasn't welcome to stay there, leaving him feeling rejected. The freewheeling, lawless world he knew was vanishing, and he seemed to be vanishing with it. His final days were spent in a prolonged drunken stupor. He left Tombstone after the 4th of July celebrations with several bottles of booze and was last seen by a sheriff's deputy who noted that he was falling off his horse. More telling were Ringo's own premonitions. He had told a newspaper editor just weeks earlier that he only had a few weeks left at best, and he implied that this event could be caused by either himself or by his enemies. Despite the official ruling, the strange clues at the scene have fueled speculation of a slaying for over a century. Several suspects have been named, their motives rooted in the legendary feuds of Tombstone, Arizona. The most famous and cinematic theory is that Wyatt Earp, perhaps accompanied by Doc Holliday, secretly rode back into Arizona to fill Ringo full of lead and complete his vendetta. Earp himself helped craft this narrative in his later years, even providing his biographer with a detailed account of a supposed duel. This story provides a satisfying, dramatic conclusion to the Earp Cowboy War, pitting the two factions' champions against each other in a final showdown. However, this theory completely falls apart under factual scrutiny since Ringo died in July 1882. Earp and his posse had fled Arizona as wanted men 4 months earlier, in March. Doc Holliday, the other supposed participant, attended court in Colorado the same day as Ringo perished. Wyatt Earp himself was documented to be in Colorado as well during this period, though his whereabouts are less ironclad. Further dispelling this account is the fact that both of these men were wanted outlaws in Arizona at the time, with substantial bounties on their heads. The consensus from historians is now that Wyatt Earp simply fabricated this event while he was building his own legend in the early 20th century. A far more plausible suspect was a man Ringo considered a friend, a very bad hombre named Buckskin Frank Leslie. Buckskin was a bartender, a scout, and a known psychopath who was, in essence, a serial predator before the terminology had been coined. The evidence against him is compelling. In November 1882, Leslie got into an argument with one of Ringo's good friends, a fellow outlaw named Billy Claiborne. To defend his honor, Buckskin promptly eliminated Claiborne, with some accounts having him finishing off the man in cold blood, even after he posed no threat. Claiborne's dying words to those around him made it clear that he had seen Buckskin shoot Ringo. Years later, while serving a sentence for slaying his wife, Buckskin reportedly confessed to a prison guard that he had, in fact, eliminated Ringo. According to this account, Buckskin, Claiborne, and Ringo were in the Turkey Creek area when the men got into an argument. Buckskin claimed he shot in self-defense, but this is a guy with a lot of bodies to his name, including completely innocent people, so take that with a grain of salt. A final, often overlooked suspect is a gambler named Michael O'Rourke. In 1881, O'Rourke eliminated a man in a nearby town over a minor disagreement, and an angry mob formed up to hunt him down. Johnny Ringo was amongst the members of this mob, and Wyatt Earp ended up stepping in to save O'Rourke's life. Under this theory, this gambler saved by Earp may have done a favor for him by taking out Johnny Ringo. While the motive is clear, the most persuasive evidence is what happened after Ringo's death. One of Ringo's closest friends later hunted down and slew Michael O'Rourke. According to some, this can be seen as a verdict delivered by way of Old West frontier justice. In the end, the death of Johnny Ringo remains an unsolvable case. The official verdict is supported by his psychological state, but contradicted by the bizarre physical evidence and circumstantial evidence. While the theory blaming Wyatt Earp directly is a fiction, the cases against Frank Leslie and Michael O'Rourke have significant circumstantial evidence in their favor. However, Unless we have some unlikely new evidence that surfaces, such as a journal entry with a very direct confession that matches the evidence, the truth will remain an unsolved mystery. The year is 1973, and America is a nation on edge, caught between the winding down of a divisive conflict in Vietnam and the escalating political scandal of Watergate. Winnie the Pooh had normalized friendly kangaroos for generations of people across the world. Nobody knew it at the time, but the cinematic masterpiece Kangaroo Jack was still 30 years away, leaving the American people starved for edgy kangaroo content. It was a time of uncertainty and eroding trust, but in the farming town of Enfield, Illinois, a small community of just 750 people, both national turmoil and kangaroos felt a world away. Life there was predictable, slow, kangaroo-free, and rooted in the familiar. That is, until the chilly spring night of April 25th, when an ordinary sound would unleash a terror that defied all explanation and etch the town's name forever into the annals of the bizarre. This is the tale of the Enfield Horror, a case that isn't just about a monster, but about how fear itself can leap into the heart of a community and become the most terrifying creature of all. The evening's strangeness began with a 10-year-old named Greg Garrett. While playing in his backyard, Garrett claimed a grotesque creature emerged from the dusk. He described a being with grayish, slimy skin, 3 legs, and huge, glowing pink eyes. The thing allegedly stomped on the boy's feet, shredding his tennis shoes before he scrambled into his house, hysterical. His father, trying to rationalize the impossible, figured his son had just startled a snake, which seems like a very unlikely explanation to me. About 30 minutes later, the focus of the night's events shifted next door. Henry McDaniel and his wife returned home around 9:30 p.m. to find their children in a state of panic. They insisted a creature had been trying to force its way into the house through the front door and a window air conditioner. As McDaniel tried to calm them, he heard it too. A distinct scratching sound at the front door. Assuming it was a stray dog, or at worst, a nuisance bear, McDaniel opened the door and came face to face with the source of his children's terror. The creature standing on his porch was like nothing he'd ever seen. He later gave police a chillingly specific description. It stood about 4.5 feet tall, with a grayish, short, almost human-like body. It had 2 disproportionately small arms that emerged from its chest, 2 enormous pink eyes that glowed like flashlights, and most unnervingly, 3 powerful legs. McDaniel instinctively slammed the door, grabbed a weapon and a flashlight, and threw the door open again. He fired 4 shots, certain that the first one found its mark, but the creature didn't fall. Instead, it let out a horrifying hiss and bounded away with impossible speed, covering an estimated 50 to 75 feet in just 3 massive leaps before vanishing into the darkness. When Illinois state troopers arrived, they found McDaniel to be completely rational, despite the bizarre encounter. Their search of the property turned up 2 pieces of physical evidence. There were fresh scratches on the siding of the house and a set of bizarre footprints in the soft earth. For nearly 2 weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over Enfield. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of May 6th, McDaniel was woken by the frantic howling of neighborhood dogs. He looked out his door and saw the creature again. This time, the animal was at a distance, calmly making its way down the nearby railroad tracks, seemingly in no hurry. This second sighting prompted McDaniel to contact a radio station in Kokomo, Indiana. That decision was the spark that ignited a media firestorm when the station's news director traveled to Enfield with a small team to investigate. They too claimed to have a close encounter of the furred kind, spotting what they described as a gray ape-like creature near an abandoned house. More importantly, they claimed they had captured the creature's cry on a tape recorder. That recording, however, was never played publicly and has since become lost media. With the story now spreading through newspapers and radio broadcasts, Enfield was overrun. Hordes of curiosity seekers, reporters, and monster hunters descended on the tiny town, creating a public safety crisis. On the night of May 8th, deputies responded to reports of shots fired and arrested 5 young men from out of town who were very much not sober. This insane posse of drunken clowns claimed that they were unloading on a creature they had seen in the woods that they thought to be the Enfield monster. Incidents like this caused the local sheriff to issue a statement that all further monster hunts were to cease, and the frenzy died down pretty quickly. So, what really stalked the railroad tracks of Enfield in 1973? Well, as the monster mania died down, more rational theories began to emerge. The most popular was that of a misidentified animal, specifically an escaped kangaroo. A kangaroo's powerful tail could easily be mistaken for a third leg, and its bounding gait matches the creature's incredible leaps. This theory was bolstered when a man from Ohio contacted the town, suggesting the creature could be his missing pet kangaroo. However, Henry McDaniel, who had been stationed in Australia during his military service and was familiar with the animals, firmly rejected this explanation. He insisted he knew what a kangaroo looked like, and that the animal he saw was nothing like one. Notably, a later investigation into the incident found that McDaniel had a history of seeing weird and wild things. This has been used to discredit the story. However, ultimately McDaniel wasn't the first person or the only person to see the creature. Personally, I think the displaced kangaroo explains nearly every physical detail, including the 3-legged leaps, the weird footprints, even the glowing eyes under flashlight beams. But what really turned a simple escaped animal into the Enfield horror was the perfect storm of media attention and small-town hysteria. In a year when Americans were already primed to distrust institutions and fear the unknown, a bizarre sighting in a quiet farming town was enough to ignite imaginations. Mass hysteria events generally erupt during times of stress upon a whole community, which really does describe the vibe in 1973 pretty well. Notably, local media didn't just report the story, they amplified it, spinning a strange but ordinary creature into something monstrous and touting a weird recording of the creature. In my view, what Enfield experienced was a layered phenomenon. At its core, there was a real kangaroo bounding through the night, but this was overlaid with the feverish storytelling of a community caught in the grip of fear. And to get ahead of the inevitable comments, I'm sure someone will suggest that this may have been an owl misidentification. And to that, all I have to say is, if you know, you know. On the morning of July 26th, 1184, the bustling town of Erfurt in central Germany hosted a gathering of high nobles that would soon go horribly and disgustingly wrong. No one could have predicted that this day would end with roughly 60 nobles being drowned in a slurry of noxious human waste. Whether this event was truly an accident, or whether this was the equivalent of a real-life red wedding with a thick coat of brown paint, remains up for debate. The Holy Roman Empire of the 12th century was rife with local feuds that threatened the realm's stability. One such conflict pitted Ludwig III, the Landgrave of Thuringia, against Conrad, the Archbishop of Mainz, in a bitter struggle over lands and authority. Erfurt itself was under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Mainz, and Ludwig aimed to challenge that control for his own gain. Their rivalry grew so heated that the young King Henry VI, at that time ruling Germany under his father Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, decided imperial intervention was necessary. Henry, eager to be seen as a strong and capable monarch, took on the mediator's role with zeal, keen to secure peace and uphold royal authority in his domains. Henry VI accordingly convened an informal royal assembly in Erfurt to bring the feuding parties together and resolve their differences. He summoned dozens of nobles, bishops, and high-ranking officials from across the empire to attend a council in late July 1184. The gathering was held in a hall within Erfurt's cathedral, and by the morning of July 26th, this hall's upper floor was packed shoulder to shoulder with important people. Most important amongst the guests included King Henry himself, Archbishop Conrad, Landgrave Ludwig, as well as numerous lesser lords and advisors. As discussions got underway that morning, the crowded assembly of nobles strained the aging upper chamber. The sheer weight of so many men put tremendous stress on the timber floor supports. According to contemporary chroniclers, without warning, those wooden beams, long weakened by years of use and neglect, suddenly gave way with a deafening crack. The upper floor collapsed and crashed down onto the level below, which in turn also failed under the impact. In an instant, the entire meeting, people, furniture, and flooring, plunged through the structure and into an enormous cesspit beneath the hall. Knights in armor, wooden tables and benches, and splintered beams all hurtled into the vile pit as the building disintegrated around them. In the chaotic moments that followed, those who fell met an appalling fate. They found themselves floundering in years of accumulated foul waste, a mix of excrement and groundwater, which had a thick, quicksand-like consistency that made escape nearly impossible. Luckier victims were crushed by falling timbers and furnishings. Those who weren't as fortunate drowned in the muck or succumbed to the poisonous miasma of the noxious fumes. The cesspit's contents were also rife with disease and parasites, adding another lethal element to the disaster. Contemporary reports indicate that roughly 60 men died then and there, and some accounts suggest the death toll may have reached closer to 100 in total. Among the dead were a number of prominent nobles. However, miraculously, or perhaps suspiciously, all the key members in attendance escaped with their lives. Interestingly, two of the most prominent individuals were completely unharmed. King Henry VI himself escaped the plunge entirely. He and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz had been sitting on a stone-reinforced window alcove when the floor fell, and they managed to cling to it as the chamber collapsed around them. Rescuers with ladders eventually pulled the king and the archbishop to safety, and while they were both shaken, and perhaps stirred, they were essentially unharmed. Landgrave Ludwig III, who had tumbled down with the rest of the crowd, also survived and was hauled out of the cesspit alive. For King Henry, there was little time to dwell on the horrific accident. Chronicles report that he departed Erfurt almost immediately afterward and resumed a military campaign he had been on, effectively abandoning the unresolved dispute between the lords. In essence, the mediation abruptly ended, and the long-standing conflict between the Landgrave and the Archbishop remained unsettled. Notably, medieval writers recorded the event only in brief entries. The king, having nearly met a truly disgusting end, had little desire to memorialize such a fiasco, and the Erfurt tragedy remained a relatively obscure footnote in imperial history. Yet the Erfurt latrine disaster's true significance lies in what didn't happen. Had Henry VI himself perished in that cesspit, the future of the empire, and indeed of European history, might have veered onto a very different path. Henry's survival ensured that he went on to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, and eventually one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He led imperial armies on crusade, he captured and ransomed England's king Richard the Lionheart, and extended his dominion deep into southern Italy and Sicily. None of those momentous events would have come to pass if an overloaded floor in Erfurt had claimed the king's life that day. People have long questioned how such a bizarre catastrophe could have occurred in the first place. The simplest explanation is also the most plausible. An overcrowded hall and structural decay combined to cause a deadly failure. The wooden floor supports were reportedly rotten, and the sheer weight of nearly 100 assembled men, many of them semi-armored nobles, was more than the old timbers could bear. The citadel's latrine below was especially large and had seldom been emptied, so it contained a vast quantity of sewage at the time. That said, there's a much more sinister theory about why this happened. The primary reason for the meeting in Erfurt was to mediate a bitter feud between two powerful men, Ludwig III, Landgrave of Thuringia, and Conrad of Wittelsbach, Archbishop of Mainz. Both were influential, ambitious, and had powerful rivals who might have found it advantageous if either or both were eliminated. Ludwig III, as Landgrave of Thuringia, was deeply involved in territorial disputes that had drawn hostility from various nobles in central Germany. His aggressive pursuit of power, coupled with his refusal to acknowledge the authority of Archbishop Conrad, placed him squarely at odds with powerful church authorities. Conrad of Mainz, for his part, wielded immense influence not only in religious matters, but in secular governance as well. It's conceivable that rival factions could have sought a permanent solution to the persistent instability caused by Ludwig and Conrad's feud. A tragedy that seemed like an accident would be a perfect cover. Plausible deniability, limited risk of exposure, and minimal direct reprisals. In essence, the Erfurt latrine disaster may have been the medieval equivalent of taking down a passenger plane just to eliminate one target. Another intriguing angle involves King Henry VI himself. It's important to remember that during the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire was an extremely powerful player in European politics, and not the decrepit entity it would develop into. At only 18, Henry was heir apparent to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and his future influence over European politics was already significant. His demise would have sent shockwaves throughout Europe, reshuffling political alliances and possibly setting off a struggle for succession that many ambitious nobles might find advantageous. Henry's father had no shortage of enemies within the empire. Many princes felt oppressed by imperial centralization efforts and would have welcomed a weakened monarchy. Removing Henry would destabilize Barbarossa's carefully planned succession, potentially freeing them from central control. If the collapse was indeed deliberate sabotage, the method, rotted or weakened floor beams, was subtle enough to appear natural, yet devastating enough to achieve maximum lethality. Whoever orchestrated this would have needed inside access to the building beforehand, a plausible scenario considering the numerous local servants and retainers employed by nobles. This method would require no elaborate weapons or obvious tampering, just deliberate weakening of the timbers, so a full haul would result in a disaster. For conspirators, the horrific randomness could be beneficial. The tragedy's broad carnage might obscure motives, eliminating suspicion on who was targeted. After all, the event had numerous high-profile attendees who had enemies who wanted them eliminated. Interestingly, many find it quite odd that Henry and the Archbishop were sitting in a stone alcove at the precise moment of the fall, while the Landgrave fell into the pit. It's been suggested that Henry and the Archbishop may have been plotting together to increase the power of the Church in the region. The thought is that this may have been in exchange for papal support of Emperor Barbarossa's attempt to turn the Holy Roman Empire into a hereditary monarchy. If this was the case, the plot failed, and Henry beat a hasty retreat, and chroniclers kept their discussions of this event to a bare minimum.